We've had 3 great talks. We've heard a lot. One of the things we want to be sure is that we're as clear as we can possibly be, that the information we're providing you is of value to you. This was brought home to me earlier this week. I was in a hospital lobby, and someone walked by with a sack of food. And she had a t-shirt on that said, "Exercise? I thought you said extra fries." So let us be sure when we're talking about exercise, that's what you're hearing rather than the extra fries. So John, one of the questions related to coffee, and it had to do with, is it coffee or is it caffeine? If it is caffeine, what about in soft drinks?
Yeah, great question. As we alluded to earlier, there's a number of bioactive substances in coffee, well over 1,000. So it's not just the caffeine. And so we don't really know what that is. So far as we know, it may not be the caffeine. So I wouldn't encourage the use of soft drinks because those have a lot of other less desirable effects in addition to the caffeine.
Good, thank you. I can't tell you how pleased I am to see so many questions coming forward. One of the questions related to the registries and what's happening with all of the various country registries. What are the plans for trying to pull together and combine these things? So Tom or Cyril, you may want to speak about this.
Very good question, and actually it's quite relevant at the moment. We will have a side meeting discussing this, how we can align the efforts and initiatives that are going on now worldwide. And I believe Chris Bose will talk about this tomorrow also.
Good, thank you. One of the important topics that, Cyril, you introduced was this difference in how we might think about the life expectancy of patients with PSC. And you talked about the 12 years from referral-based populations to the 21 years now in the countrywide things. People are interested in that. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think if you have a patient that's coming to your outpatient clinic and you make a diagnosis of PSC, you should tell him or her, if they want to know, and that's one of the first questions when they've realized what a disease they have. Okay, doctor, what's my outlook? Then I think you should tell them, okay, you're more or less a patient that might also have been a citizen of the Netherlands or the UK, and we have figures, population-based figures from these countries, and your outlook is about 21 years before you will run into a liver transplant or worse. If you have a patient that has been referred, if you're working in a transplant center, you get a patient that's referred from elsewhere because he or she is not doing good, and the patient asks you the same question, then I think you should be honest and tell them, well, in transplantation centers, the median transplant-free survival is 12 to 14 years. So that's how you should deal with it.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions about the microbiome, and I think two of the speakers for sure spoke a little bit about that. A number of factors can cause it to vary. How will those variations, whether they're geography or diet, be accounted for? And then what are the plans for potentially manipulating the microbiome for therapy?
I'll take
both people are pointing at each other, so we know it's a good question.
Yeah. Wonderful question. I think a very hot topic and will continue to be a hot topic in the years to come. In terms of how to potentially manipulate the microbiome, I think there is interest, preliminary interest in about the role of fecal transplantation or delivery mechanism or to perhaps alter the microbiome via that route under early investigation. Whether or not that would be successful is very unclear. There's been some interest in the role of antibiotics, and there's been a variety of studies with vancomycin and others as a potential mechanism to impact the microbiome as well, and additional studies of that are certainly needed before that could be recommended.
Yeah, I mean, this is something which is very actively under research at the moment. I think what I wanted to show you with this figure where you have the gut on the one side and the liver on the other side, and there are things going both ways, that the gut and the liver, they're sort of a collaborative unit. There's this concept of co-metabolism, where basically the gut microbiota is an integral part of your own physiology in a way. And I think that the differences that we're currently observing and the insight that we have, it's very superficial. It's very rough. We need to really understand the details on how this machinery works, and this will take some time. Only then we will actually be able, in my very scientific mind, to do appropriate and specific manipulation. However, there are, of course, as you already allude to, more kind of gross approaches, fecal transplantation, for instance. I think you're doing that at the moment in the Netherlands, Cyril, right?
Yes, we have done a fecal transplantation study in patients with ulcerative colitis, which yielded more questions than answers, I should say. And one should realize that when it comes to genes, there is about 40,000 human genes with which you have a big struggle with, and there's 40 million genes, bacterial genes in your gut. So that's even a more complex thing to deal with. So we're really in the infancy of this topic. But it is very hard, and we're doing research, and in fact we're trying to set up, in collaboration with the people from Oslo and Sweden, a fecal transplantation pilot study in PSC patients.
Thank you. Tom, there's a number of questions about associated other autoimmune diseases and family, or diseases running in families in patients with PSC, including celiac disease and lupus. Any comments about those associations?
Yeah, I mean, this was, I would say, perhaps the biggest disappointment that we've had over the course of the years of doing genetics in PSC, that we didn't really find any PSC genes. They were all like genes associating with PSC, celiac disease, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, etc., etc. So what we actually have been drilling into with PSC is sort of a common background genetic risk system, which causes an enhanced risk for all these autoimmune diseases, not only PSC. On one hand, you can say that's a disappointment, but on the other hand, actually, we can also then conclude, having done all these genetic assessments, that PSC indeed looks from the genetic perspective as an autoimmune disease, and we have never really been sure about that. I mean, immunosuppression doesn't work. There are many contradictory data there, but at least from the genetic perspective, it looks like an autoimmune disease, and I believe that these shared genetic risk factor is also the reason for why we see this this accumulation of other inflammatory diseases in the patients.
Thank you. Well, John, I think you've opened the door. People have heard you talk about the effects of nicotine and smoking, coffee. So now people are wondering about alcohol, marijuana, and genetically altered foods.
Okay. All right. Very good questions. So there's really no data about marijuana use in PSC that I'm aware of. So to directly answer that, it hasn't been well studied. In terms of alcohol use, when people retrospectively go back and they ask somebody with a chronic liver illness, do you drink alcohol? The majority are going to say no, understandably. And so that's not necessarily a cause and effect relationship there. And in terms of nicotine, there were a few small studies in the mid-1990s by the late Paul Angulo and our European colleagues that looked at nicotine supplementation, either through an oral nicotine tablet or through a transdermal patch. And it had no impact on PSC-related outcomes or liver tests in these small studies.
Thanks. Cyril, there are a number of questions about the association of colon cancer risk and colitis, inflammatory bowel disease. One of the questions was whether patients who've had a colectomy have a reduced risk of cancer. Clearly, colorectal cancer would be reduced, but hepatobiliary neoplasia, is that changed? And then another question that related to some of the things you had spoken about was, are there predictors of people are on a fast track or a slow track of disease progression? I think people are, you did show data about presence or absence of symptoms. Is that fixed? Do people go from one symptomatic to asymptomatic or vice versa? Can you give the audience any clues as to what they might be looking at as how they individually might be thinking about the course of their disease?
Excellent questions. You should all become researchers, I would say. In fact, one of the things we are looking into at the moment is whether we can find predictors, be it biomarkers or other phenotypical parameters, which can put patients into high-risk categories or low-risk categories for getting colorectal dysplasia and neoplasia, so colon cancer. Because in our current practice, we think that we are doing a lot of those annual burdensome surveillance colonoscopies for nothing. I told you about the risk in Crohn's disease of the colon, which seems to be lower, but it might also be that in some patients with ulcerative colitis, they will never get, in fact, the majority, of course, will not get colon cancer, but they're not at an increased risk either. So we're trying to figure out whether there's any clues we can get in patients who are at increased risk, yes or no. With regard to symptoms and the involvement of symptoms, this is one of the things that we need these prospective cohorts for, these natural history cohorts, to see whether the data that Ulrike Brome 20 years ago showed are really still there, and that symptoms can sort of more or less affect your risk of getting into an endpoint within due time, yes or no. In fact, we don't know, and for this we really need this prospective history things. So I think in a few years' time we will be able to tell you whether certain symptoms are really predictive of having a worse prognosis, yes or no. One should realize that PSC is a very complex disease, and it also has an undulating course, also with regard to symptoms. It goes up and down. For instance, when you have a dominant stricture, so a really stricture in your large bile ducts, and it becomes occluded because of inspissated bile, you get a lot of symptoms. But when you have a good doctor and endoscopist, and this will also be talked about later in this meeting, and he does a ESOP, and he can technically nicely solve the stricture, then your symptoms go down. Now we know from studies from Germany that the chance of getting such a stricture is about 10% per year. So that means that if you have no stricture, the chance that you will have one in 5 years' time will be about 40–50%. But not all these strictures are symptomatic. And so that's a problem, how to interpret them. And when they are symptomatic, you can even get very jaundiced, and you treat them satisfactorily. The disease symptoms come into remission, and in some patients can remain for a long time in remission. So the short answer is we don't have good clues with regard to symptoms if how they put patients at risk for a poorer or better prognosis.
Thank you. Tom, this largely U.S. audience is wondering, are there genetic studies that are being conducted here in the United States? And if so, how can people get involved in those studies?
Oh yes, there are indeed genetic initiatives. I mean, the big study that I briefly showed you some data from regarding the PSC versus IBD relationship, it's actually being led partly by Kostas Lazaridis at the Mayo Clinic, together with UK investigators. So Kostas Lazaridis would definitely be a contact point. Also Chris Bolus, which many of you will be familiar with, at UC Davis, has over the years been working into genetics of PSC, both in Americans of Northern European origin, but also African Americans. So I would say, as far as I'm aware of, those would be the two main contact points: Chris Bolus at UC Davis and Kostas Lazaridis at the Mayo Clinic. And maybe you, John, want to say something about that.
Great, wonderful question. I think if somebody is interested in hearing more about that research, Eric Schlicht is a study coordinator of CASAS, and he's out at a table in that corner. So if somebody was interested in hearing more, he would be able to provide you that information. He's right outside.
Thank you. Serial tried to make all of you become researchers in PSC. But we have 3 researchers here in PSC, and someone asked the question, please ask these speakers to rank order what they feel they need from a patient community, you, to help develop curative therapy. So I'm going to ask each of those, of the 3 speakers to respond to that question. What are the 3 things that you think this organization could do to help us move towards curative or at least effective therapies?
I think broadly speaking, is what's going on right now, and that is organization and collaboration among patients, but also among scientists, and trying to work together, sharing data to try to move the field forward. I think broadly speaking, that's a key thing.
I think I can't agree more. It's a rare disease, and we can only bring this disease forward when we collaborate on a global scale. The IPCC group is doing it very effectively under the guidance of the Oslo group. You have a very strong patient perspective here, with which we should align, and we're already doing that. We need data, and we need material. So we need patients' data, we need patient samples like blood and maybe feces and urine, and for that, people like you can collaborate.
Yeah, I wouldn't be saying too much because then I preempt what I'm going to say during the dinner tonight. But clearly there is a need for working together, both in basically participation in studies. Also, we need to know where are the main concerns, where are your main worries, where are your main symptoms, etc. So we also need some reminders and some directions. Some people that can tell us, okay, listen, guy, this is probably scientifically very interesting, but to us it doesn't really matter. So I think that there is two-way communication here, which we definitely can enhance. And you are more than we are. There are more patients than there are researchers, so you can do a lot. Yeah.
I'm going to preempt my talk on Monday, and Serial has been working on, and a number of you have been participants in, a workshop at the FDA that looked at study endpoints. And I think that the patient perspective was very helpful in that discussion, because ultimately, in order to have therapies available, they have to be studied, approved, and then enter the market. And for that, we need to have interactions with pharmaceutical companies and the regulatory bodies. So your engagement at that level has been extremely beneficial as well.
Could I add one example to that? There is a drug called natalizumab, which interacts with the homing of lymphocytes to the brain. And it was approved for multiple sclerosis. Then it was found out that 3 in 1,000 people using natalizumab get a very severe infection of the brain leading to death. So the regulators wanted to withdraw the drug from the market. And then the patient with multiple sclerosis stand up and say, we don't want this drug to be withdrawn from the market. It works. And if we have only a chance of 3 in 1,000 to get this severe side effect, we will take that for granted. We still want that drug. So there was a very, very important message from the patient perspective, which the scientists and the regulators didn't realize. Just an example.
Another question related to liver transplant, and how often does PSC occur after transplant? Are there mechanisms that we think might be causative for PSC in the non-transplanted state, still operating after transplant? So are there risk factors for some of the other things that we've heard about the same before and after transplant? So any of the panelists who want to address this, please do.
Well, it has to do with natural history, so I'll start. But I'm not from a transplant center, so Tom will correct me if I'm wrong. About 25% of patients after transplantation will develop a picture that resembles at least PSC. So they get strictures in their bile ducts and inflammation and all that. If this has been looked at in detail, 50% of them, so in total about 15% of patients will have again PSC, which in a low amount of patients will in the end lead to again liver failure and another transplantation. If this is true PSC, or it has to be, it has some bearing to the transplantation and the techniques that they use for transplantation, is still elusive. But more or less, if you don't care what it's called, but you just mind, get I a disease picture which resembles my previous disease, then it's about in 25% in the long run. Tom.
No, I mean, this is a very challenging diagnosis, which I think you're already alluding to. I mean, there are so many things that can happen to a new liver after transplantation, and that actually may look like PSC. So probably some of the things that we call recurrent PSC is actually not recurrent PSC. However, it is probably not that uncommon that there is some PSC recurring in the liver graft. However, I think an important message is that it very rarely, or I mean in some instances it do, but rarely it leads to the need of a new liver transplant, at least in the follow-up that we so far have for these patients. It's very interesting also with regards to disease mechanisms in PSC, and again coming to this paradox that I alluded to with the genetics, that we think, looking at it from the genetic perspective, that PSC is an autoimmune disease, whatever an autoimmune disease might be. However, the immunosuppression doesn't work, and here we have patients who are on heavy immunosuppression and still they have a recurrent disease. So there is some mechanistic lessons to be learned, and I think we should be studying these patients much more closely. We're trying to do it in Oslo. There are also other initiatives going on around the world. One important point which is often up when we talk about recurrent PSC is this relationship between colectomy, basically having the bowel removed prior to transplant, and the risk of recurrent PSC. There are UK data showing that there is less recurrent PSC if you do not have the colon. We actually do not see that strong association in Scandinavia. I think that there are some conflicting data also from the Mayo Clinic. So at the moment there is absolutely no robust advice in terms of colectomy prior to transplant. I think that's an important point I really want to make, that we don't do that, and this is more of a scientific topic than clinical practice at the moment.
But the main message should be, it should never be an argument not to proceed to a liver transplantation if you are in need of a new liver.
On the other end of the spectrum, people are wondering about small duct PSC. Could some of the apparent improvements in natural history be related to greater recognition and more small duct PSCs, patients being included in the cohort? Are the genetic factors different between large duct and small duct PSC, and do some of the environmental risks that we've heard about pertain to small duct as well as large duct PSC? So in sequence, if you'd answer those questions.
You pose difficult questions.
It's not me.
No, I'm not. I wasn't looking at you. I wasn't looking at the audience. You pose difficult questions. And the most difficult one is actually, a small duct PSC is more or less defined as that you don't see the PSC on regular imaging, like an ESCP or an MRCP, although you can ask the question, is an MRCP sensitive enough to really exclude large duct PSC? So we don't really know if it's a distinct entity which never progresses to large duct PSC, or it is an early form of large duct PSC which behaves so benign that it never or only occasionally progresses to large duct PSC. We don't know this yet. This is one of the reasons we need these prospective, well carried out studies to see if indeed small duct PSC can progress to large duct PSC. So this is why it's difficult.
I think, I mean, there's a simplification that can be made slightly with regards to small duct PSC, which, and of course, any simplification is never accurate. But I think some of the patients with small duct PSC, they actually do not have PSC. And remember what I mentioned to you, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about PSC is this disease which affects the bowel and the liver at the same time. Some of these patients have different entities. There may be, you know, defects in bile, transporter machineries, genetic diseases. So I would say it's half of half. There is half PSC, which it then occurs in an early stage, and then there is something else going on in the rest of the patients. And when it comes to making a diagnosis of small duct PSC, we in Norway would require concurrent inflammatory bowel disease normally as the case. However, I mean, again, I think it's a mixed bag. It's not one thing.
And as Tom alluded to it, that all those factors and the relative rarity of it makes it difficult to study environmental associations in small duct PSC specifically. So for example, in one of the studies that looked at dietary associations in PSC, there was 1,000 patients in that cohort, but only about 30 or 40 actually had clear-cut small duct PSC. And so that then makes it very difficult to tease out any other associations with those small numbers.
Thank you. There's several questions about factors that might otherwise be associated with PSC. So John, this is probably for you. Does vitamin D have anything to do with the risk of PSC? Are there medications that people use commonly for unrelated conditions that might be associated with the development of PSC? Do the yo-yo diets influence PSC? And does life stressors have any effect? Some people suspect that there might be an onset after a stressful life event.
Yeah. I'll tackle the stress part first. So I think we don't know if stress plays any role in PSC, but I think philosophically, having stress in life does make it very difficult to deal with other health issues that you're confronted with. So it goes from having to carry 10 pounds of bricks and then you're stressed, and then it's now like carrying 50 pounds of bricks. So stress does make things very difficult. But there's nothing to suggest that it causes PSC. Similarly, there's nothing to suggest that a particular medicine, vitamin D, or fad diets have any role in the pathogenesis of PSC.
Okay, thank you. The final question I'm going to pose, and then we'll open it up if there are any other questions, is to the experts. With all that you know about PSC and IBD, what would you do if you had a loved one with this disease? Would you recommend certain diets, such as gluten-free, dairy-free, or sugar-free, the role of probiotics, or any other recommendations that you would make with all of that you know?
Why me? I think I would recommend the same as I recommend my patients. So be sparse on alcohol use, because we know that the liver has a large redundancy. You can have 300 grams of liver is enough to function, and you have about 1,200 grams to start with. But alcohol is bad for your liver, and when alcohol helps to reduce the functional liver from 1,200 to, let's say, 600 grams, then you're closer to this risk amount below which you can get into trouble. So I would try my patients, and so also my loved one, to reduce on alcohol consumption, and for the rest, nothing, because the rest also all pertains to the inflammatory bowel disease part, and we don't know anything about diet and lifestyle habits with regards to inflammatory bowel disease, other than that it's really individually it has an individual component. So there are people who do not tolerate cabbage, so I tell them don't use cabbage. There are people who have to go much more often to the toilet when they use soft drinks, so don't use soft drinks. Probiotica, fine, but it's way too, the amount of bacteria that are in the probiotica formulas is way too low to affect anything in your microbiota composition, which is 1,000 times more than what is in probiotica formula. The only thing that is starting to emerge with regard to inflammatory bowel disease is that high fiber diets are probably beneficial. So I would ask them, my loved ones, and also I'm telling my patients, if you want to change something in your diet, go to a high fiber diet.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can concur with many of the things that Cyril says. I mean, when it comes to therapy, I think the advice that I would provide to the person in question would be that be open to new therapies, but do them in the context of clinical trials. Don't go around shopping for, you know, random opportunities and non-scientific medication. I would stick with that advice. Engage in clinical trials if you want to have a first shot at the new medications. That's where I would have something to add. Yeah.
Agree with everything that's been said. I think that globally speaking, staying physically active and fit and trying to control and modify those other things in life, maybe not specific to PSC, but overall well-being, I think is important. And partnering with a healthcare professional who you trust and who is knowledgeable and who could guide you through this process is important too.
Thank you. I've gotten the sign. We're out of time. Speakers will be here if you have questions. Thanks a lot for all of the questions.